My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my own family inflicted. As a successful commercial real estate developer in Chicago, I spent my entire life building an empire to give them everything. But instead of gratitude, they saw me as an endless cash machine. Last Thanksgiving, they invited me to dinner at the upscale North Shore mansion I bought for them in full. Between the roasted turkey and the vintage wine I paid for, my daughter slammed her glass down, shattering the crystal, and screamed at me to shut up. I simply stood up, grabbed my keys, and walked out into the freezing night. But what I discovered on my phone a few minutes later changed everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. To understand how a father decides to erase his own flesh and blood from his life, you have to understand the sheer audacity of what happened in that dining room. It was late November. The wind coming off Lake Michigan was already biting, carrying the promise of a brutal winter. Inside, however, the dining room was warm, glowing with the light of crystal chandeliers. This was Victoria and Bradley's home, a sprawling $3.5 million estate in the North Shore. A beautiful home indeed. And it was a home I bought for them outright with a single wire transfer just 3 years ago. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table quietly cutting my meal. Across from me sat my daughter Victoria. She is 38 years old, a vice president of public relations at a boutique firm, a title that sounds impressive but barely covers the cost of her designer wardrobe. Next to her was her husband Bradley. He is 40, a man who calls himself a crypto and tech venture capitalist, though I have yet to see any actual capital venture out of his pockets. Further down the table sat my son Cameron and his wife Monica. Cameron is 35, supposedly a real estate developer, though his projects seem to spend more time in bankruptcy court than in construction. Monica, at 33, spends her days obsessing over her status at the local country club, treating the staff poorly, and pretending her husband is a titan of industry. They were all laughing, drinking expensive wine that I had sent over from my private cellar, eating a lavish meal prepared by a private chef whose invoice had been mysteriously forwarded to my accountant the week before. I did not mind providing for them. Since my wife Martha passed away 3 years ago, I thought giving them comfort would keep us close. I was wrong. It only bred severe entitlement. The conversation turned to finance. It always did with Bradley. He was holding court, waving his fork around loudly, bragging to Cameron about a massive new tech investment he had leveraged. He boasted about buying on margin, predicting a massive short squeeze that would double his net worth in a month. I listened quietly for a while. I have spent 40 years in commercial real estate. I survived the crashes of '87, 2008, and everything in between. I know exactly what over-leveraged arrogance sounds like. Bradley, I said, calmly setting down my knife. The market is incredibly volatile right now. If you are heavily leveraged on margin, and that tech stock dips even 10%, you are going to face a margin call you cannot cover. You need to be careful. You are playing with fire. It was a piece of gentle, seasoned advice from a man who had built a 9-figure empire from the ground up. I was trying to protect him. I was trying to protect my daughter's future. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Victoria slammed her wine glass down onto the mahogany table. She hit it with such unexpected force that the delicate crystal stem snapped in half. Dark red wine splashed across the pristine white linen tablecloth, pooling like blood. The entire room went dead silent. The private chef who was pouring water near the corner froze in his tracks. Victoria leaned forward, her face twisted into an ugly, contemptuous sneer. "Shut up, Dad!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Nobody cares for your outdated lectures. The world does not work the way it did in the 1980s. You do not understand technology. You do not understand modern wealth. You are just a washed-up old man who got lucky with some brick-and-mortar buildings. Stop ruining our dinner with your miserable negativity." I sat perfectly still. I looked at Bradley. He did not defend me. He did not tell his wife to calm down. He just adjusted his collar and took a sip of his water, a smug expression settling on his face. I slowly turned my gaze to my son. Cameron was carving a piece of turkey, a distinct smirk playing on his lips. Beside him, Monica popped a piece of asparagus into her mouth, chewing slowly, looking at me with undisguised amusement. In that single crystallized moment, the veil dropped. The illusion of family loyalty dissolved completely. They did not respect me. They did not love me. To them, I was not a father mourning his late wife seeking the warmth of his children on a holiday. I was a foolish, wealthy old fossil, an inconvenience they had to tolerate to keep the money flowing. A weaker man might have argued. A softer father might have demanded respect, raised his voice, or broken down in tears, asking where he went wrong. But I did not build my life by begging for respect. I demand it, and when it is absent, I remove my presence. I did not say a single word. I carefully placed my linen napkin on the table. I pushed my chair back, the sound scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Where are you going?" Victoria demanded, rolling her eyes. "Are you going to throw a tantrum now?" I ignored her. I walked out of the dining room, my footsteps echoing in the massive foyer of the house my money bought. I went to the coat closet, retrieved my heavy cashmere overcoat, and pulled my Porsche keys from the pocket. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. The bitter wind hit my face, but it felt remarkably refreshing. It felt like clarity. I walked down the long paved driveway and climbed into the driver's seat of my car. I shut the door, sealing out the howling wind. The leather seat was cold. I sat there in the dark for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel. They had told me to shut up. They had called me a washed-up old man. I decided right then and there that I would give them exactly what they wanted. I would shut up. I would step out of their lives completely. I vowed in the silence of my car that I would never return to that house. That was the last meal we would ever share. I pulled out my phone. I knew the first step was to sever the financial umbilical cord. I opened my private banking application, intending to instantly freeze the 3 platinum credit cards I allowed Victoria Cameron and Bradley to use for their so-called living expenses. I logged in, navigating to the card management section. But as the main dashboard loaded on my screen, my thumb hovered over the freeze button. My eyes locked onto the screen, and my breath caught in my throat. There, at the very top of my recent transactions list, glowing in stark, unarguable text, was a pending withdrawal. $150,000. It had just been initiated, and it was not coming from any of the shared credit cards. It was being pulled directly from my private family trust account, an account that only I and my legal proxy, in case of a medical emergency, had access to. I stared at the numbers. $150,000. My heart hammered against my ribs, a cold dread washing over me. This was not a late-night shopping spree. This was not an impulsive vacation booking. This was a calculated, unauthorized raid on a highly secured trust fund. I looked up through the windshield at the brightly lit windows of the mansion. Inside, my children were laughing, drinking my wine, mocking my age. And right under my nose, someone in that house was quietly draining my life savings. This was no longer just about disrespect. This was theft. And as I sat in the freezing dark, I realized that the nightmare of this Thanksgiving was only just beginning. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the numbers burning into my vision. $150,000. The reality was breathtaking. While I sat in my freezing car, one of my children was actively attempting to siphon massive cash from a secured trust fund. My finger hovered over the screen. With a single tap, I canceled the pending transaction. I then immediately initiated a global freeze on every credit card linked to my primary accounts. The platinum cards in Victoria's designer purse, the black cards in Bradley's wallet, the corporate expense accounts Cameron used to fund his failing projects. All of them were rendered completely useless in an instant. I put the phone in my pocket, started the engine of my vehicle, and drove away from the North Shore mansion. I did not look back once. The drive back to my downtown Chicago penthouse was long and bitterly cold. The wind howled against the windows, a stark contrast to the heavy silence settling inside the cabin of my car. When I finally arrived at my building, the concierge greeted me with a polite nod, but I barely registered his presence. I took the private elevator up to the top floor, stepping into the massive empty space that had become my sanctuary since Martha passed away. The panoramic views of the city skyline usually brought me peace, but tonight, the glittering lights merely looked like distant, cold stars. I took off my coat, poured myself a small glass of scotch, and sat in my leather armchair. I placed my phone on the glass coffee table right in front of me. I waited. I told myself they would call. Surely once the initial anger of the argument wore off, Victoria would realize how incredibly disrespectful she had been. She would call to make sure her elderly father had made it home safely through the freezing weather. Or Cameron would call to apologize for sitting there and smirking while his sister berated the man who had given him everything. I sat in that chair for hours watching the ice slowly melt in my glass. The phone remained completely dark. It never rang. Not once. The first day passed in a quiet blur. I went about my usual routine, reading the financial papers, checking the global markets, and drinking my black coffee. Every few minutes, my eyes would drift back to my phone. I left the ringer volume turned all the way up. The silence was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that spoke volumes about my actual place in their lives. By the time the sun set on the second day, a profound and terrible realization began to take root in my mind. They did not care about my safety. They did not care about my feelings. They were simply waiting for me to cool off so they could resume using me as their personal bank. The illusion I had desperately clung to for the past 3 years shattered completely. I was not a father to them anymore. I was an automated teller machine. I was a safety net they could abuse, stretch to the absolute limit, and ignore whenever it suited them. They assumed my love was unconditional, which meant my wallet would always be open, regardless of how terribly they treated me. I had enabled this behavior. I had rewarded their disrespect with luxury vacations, down payments, and debt bailouts. I had built the very monsters that were now trying to bleed me dry. On the morning of the third day, the silence was finally broken. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I walked over, picking it up with a strange sense of calm. It was a text message from Cameron. It did not ask how I was doing. It did not contain a single word of apology for the Thanksgiving dinner. Instead, it was a short, demanding, and incredibly arrogant message. It read, "Dad, why are the contractor funds blocked? The bank just rejected a $50,000 wire transfer for the downtown project. You need to call them and authorize it immediately. My crew is threatening to walk off the site." I read the message 3 times. He was not asking for a favor. He was issuing a command. He was completely oblivious to the fact that I had intentionally frozen his access, assuming it was a mere banking error. He genuinely believed he was entitled to my money, even after allowing his sister to humiliate me. The sheer entitlement made my blood run cold. I did not reply to his text. Instead, I walked into my home office, turned on my desktop computer, and opened the encrypted folders containing my real estate portfolio. It was time to review exactly what they thought they owned. Years ago, when I purchased the North Shore mansion for Victoria and Bradley, and the massive suburban estate for Cameron and Monica, my corporate attorney Victor had insisted on a specific legal structure. I had waved off his concerns at the time, insisting that family was family. But Victor was a ruthless, brilliant man who trusted no one, and he had quietly structured the purchases to protect my assets. I opened the digital deeds to both properties. The documents were beautifully clear. Victoria and Bradley did not own their $3.5 million mansion. Cameron and Monica did not own their estate. Legally, both properties were wholly owned by a holding company, and I was the sole proprietor of that holding company. I had allowed them to live in those houses rent-free, paying the property taxes and maintenance costs out of my own pocket, simply letting them pretend they were successful homeowners. They had convinced themselves that my money was their money. I printed out the deeds, the property tax records, and the holding company registration. The printer hummed quietly in the corner, producing the stark, undeniable proof of my leverage. I stacked the papers neatly on my mahogany desk. If they wanted to treat me like a bank, they were about to learn exactly how a bank treats defaulting, disrespectful clients. I sat back in my desk chair looking at the stack of documents. The sorrow I had felt on Thanksgiving night was entirely gone. It had been burned away, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. My children had picked a fight with a man who had built his empire by destroying anyone who tried to take advantage of him. As I organized the legal files into a leather binder, the intercom on my office wall suddenly buzzed. The sharp sound broke the quiet atmosphere. I pressed the communication button. The lobby concierge spoke, his voice tense. "Mr. Caldwell, your daughter Victoria and your son Cameron are downstairs. They are crying hysterically, begging to come up." I released the button and smiled coldly. 3 days of absolute radio silence. Now that the credit cards were declining and the free cash flow was finally choked off, they suddenly remembered they had a father. The sheer predictability of their greed was truly pathetic. I leaned forward and pressed the intercom button again. "Send them up." I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights blur against the freezing rain, waiting for the private elevator doors to open. A soft chime echoed through the penthouse. The polished steel doors slid apart with a quiet hiss, revealing my 2 children. They looked entirely different from the arrogant, mocking figures I had left behind in the North Shore dining room just 3 days ago. Victoria's face was pale and streaked with mascara. She wore a simple trench coat over sweatpants. Cameron stood slightly behind her, shifting his weight nervously from side to side. He looked disheveled, his eyes darting around my living room, as if searching for an escape route. The theatrical display of grief was impressive. If I had not spent the last 72 hours sitting in silence and realizing the depth of their greed, I might have felt a pang of paternal sympathy. Instead, I felt nothing but a cold, clinical curiosity. I wanted to see exactly how they would attempt to manipulate me this time. Victoria took a hesitant step forward, her hands trembling as she clutched her leather handbag against her chest. She let out a ragged sob. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am so incredibly sorry for what happened on Thanksgiving. I was out of my mind. I did not mean a single word I said." She took another step, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "Things have been so terrible lately," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "Bradley is falling apart. That tech investment he was bragging about at dinner completely collapsed the very next morning. He lost everything. The bank is threatening to seize his assets. He has not slept in days. He is talking about ending his own life, Dad. He is suicidal. I have been terrified to leave him alone for even a minute. The stress broke me. I snapped at you because I was drowning in fear, and I could not admit how badly we had failed. It was just the pressure. Please, you have to forgive me." I watched her wipe her eyes, marveling at the plausibility of her lie. She painted herself as a terrified wife protecting a desperate husband, turning her vicious disrespect into a tragic symptom of extreme psychological duress. It was the perfect narrative to disarm a loving father. It was designed to replace my anger with protective concern. I nodded slowly, maintaining a carefully neutral expression, masking the absolute disgust burning in my chest. Before I could respond to her performance, Cameron stepped forward, seizing the opening she had created. He ran a hand through his messy hair, looking at the floor in mock shame. "It has been a nightmare for me too, Dad," he murmured, his voice heavy with manufactured defeat. "The reason I was so tense at dinner is that my flagship downtown development project is on the verge of total collapse. The city inspectors hit us with unexpected permit violations. The primary contractor is threatening to walk off the job tomorrow morning unless I hand over $50,000 in cash to cover the emergency payroll. If they walk, the investors will pull out, and I will be personally bankrupt by Friday. I was just so overwhelmed by my own failures that I could not even process what Victoria was yelling at you. I failed you by not standing up for you, but I am begging you to understand the crisis we are in. It is just a one-time crisis. I just need $50,000 to bridge the gap until Monday. Please, Dad. We are drowning and you are the only one who can throw us a lifeline. I looked back and forth between them. The synchronized strategy was brilliantly executed. Victoria provided the emotional distress to soften my defenses, and Cameron delivered the urgent financial crisis to extract the money. They genuinely believed I was a foolish, forgiving old man who would simply open his checkbook to make their tears stop. I decided to give them exactly the reaction they were banking on. I let my shoulders slump, forcing my posture to mimic the weary surrender of an aging patriarch. I sighed deeply, running a hand over my face as if wiping away my justified anger. You both should have just told me what was going on, I said, making my voice sound weak and slightly confused. You know you do not have to hide these struggles from me. Family must support family through difficult times. The visible relief that washed over their faces was instantaneous. Victoria let out a dramatic breath, rushing forward to wrap her arms around my shoulders. Thank you, Dad, she cried into my coat. Thank you so much. I gently patted her back, feeling the cold calculation beneath her embrace. I stepped away and walked over to my mahogany desk. I opened the top drawer, retrieved my checkbook, and uncapped my fountain pen. I wrote out a check for exactly $50,000, making sure my handwriting looked slightly shakier than usual. I handed the slip of paper to Cameron. He snatched it with a greed so profound he could not completely hide the spark of triumph in his eyes. Just promise me this is the last time, I told him, playing the role of the gullible senior citizen perfectly. We need to have a serious meeting about managing your finances next week. I cannot fix these problems forever. Cameron folded the check and shoved it into the inner pocket of his heavy wool coat. Absolutely, Dad, he promised quickly, already backing toward the elevator. We will sit down and go over everything, I swear. We just need to go handle this contractor right now before it is too late. Thank you again. You saved us. Victoria offered one last tearful smile, gripping her brother's arm. We love you, Dad. We will call you tomorrow. They practically sprinted into the elevator, desperate to secure the funds before I could suddenly change my mind. The steel doors slid shut, sealing away their fake gratitude. I stood alone in the quiet penthouse, the silence returning in full force. I took a deep breath, letting the charade drop from my shoulders. As I turned to walk back to my desk, a small patch of white caught my eye. It was quietly resting on the dark hardwood floor right where Cameron had been standing. When he had hastily shoved the check into his coat, he had accidentally dislodged something else. I slowly walked over and bent down to pick it up from the floor. It was a thick piece of paper folded twice into a neat square. I unfolded the document carefully, smoothing out the creases. My blood turned to absolute ice as I read the bold black text printed across the top margin of the thick, official-looking paper. It was a finalized draft for a medical power of attorney, explicitly naming Cameron and Victoria as my primary conservators. Below their names, highlighted in bright yellow marker, was a heavily detailed medical clause formally declaring me entirely mentally unfit to manage my own massive estate. I stood completely paralyzed in the middle of my silent penthouse, the heavy folded paper trembling in my hands. The black ink seemed to blur and pulse under the recessed lighting, spelling out a betrayal so profound it defied basic human logic. A medical power of attorney. My own children had already named themselves as my primary conservators. They had paid some unscrupulous attorney to draft the exact legal language required to strip me of my autonomy, my real estate empire, and my dignity. The sheer cold calculation of the document was entirely staggering. Cameron and Victoria had not come to my home tonight to apologize for their Thanksgiving behavior. They had not come to beg for a simple contractor loan. They had come to assess my mental state to see if any cracks were showing, to measure exactly how close they were to springing this horrific legal trap. The $50,000 check I had just handed them was nothing but a convenient bonus to tide them over while they eagerly waited for the main event. They were actively plotting to declare me legally incompetent, to lock me away in some facility, while they liquidated my life's work. As the monstrous weight of this reality settled over me, a sudden and familiar tightness gripped the very center of my chest. It was not merely the emotional shock of their betrayal. It was a severe physical reaction. My heart, already weakened by decades of relentless corporate stress, and the inevitable toll of age, began to hammer a wildly irregular, painful rhythm against my ribs. A sharp, squeezing sensation radiated aggressively down my left arm, instantly stealing the breath from my lungs. I crumpled the terrible legal document in my fist. My knees suddenly felt weak and frighteningly unstable. I desperately needed my medication. I had suffered a mild but terrifying cardiac event exactly 2 years ago, and my top cardiologist had prescribed a highly specialized, incredibly expensive imported medication to keep my heart rhythm perfectly stabilized. I was instructed to take it immediately when these specific episodes occurred, or the physical consequences could be entirely fatal. I clutched my chest tightly with my free hand, forcing myself to take deep, measured breaths as a cold, clammy sweat broke out across my forehead and the back of my neck. The pain rapidly intensified, feeling exactly like a heavy iron vice tightening mercilessly around my sternum. I stumbled blindly forward, my expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished hardwood floor. I leaned heavily against the long hallway wall, using the smooth surface to support my failing weight as I slowly made my agonizing way toward the master bathroom. Every single step was a monumental effort. My vision swam with dark, terrifying spots, the luxurious details of my beautiful penthouse fading into a narrow tunnel of gray panic. I focused my entire being entirely on reaching the cool marble vanity where my life-saving pills were kept safely in the top drawer. As I dragged my heavy feet across the plush carpet of my bedroom, my mind involuntarily flashed to my daughter. Victoria had been so remarkably persistently attentive regarding this specific prescription. When the doctor had first ordered the complex medication, she had immediately and aggressively volunteered to manage all the monthly refills. She had claimed she desperately wanted to take care of her aging father, insisting that the specialty pharmacy was right next to her public relations firm, and that it would be absolutely no trouble for her to pick up the expensive bottles every single month. I had been deeply touched by the seemingly selfless gesture at the time. I had foolishly thought it was a rare, genuine sign of affection from a daughter who was usually far too busy curating her fake social media presence to bother with my declining health. She would bring the amber plastic bottles to my penthouse personally, always making a grand show of kissing my cheek and reminding me to take them exactly as directed. I had trusted her implicitly with my very life. I had dutifully swallowed those capsules every day, believing with all my heart that they were keeping me alive and strong. The deeply cruel irony of that misplaced trust now burned much hotter than the physical pain radiating through my chest. I finally reached the master bathroom, collapsing heavily against the solid edge of the marble counter. I gasped for air, my reflection in the wide vanity mirror showing a pale, sweating old man who looked every bit as vulnerable as his greedy children hoped he was. I yanked the top drawer open with trembling fingers, my breath coming in short, painful rasps. I grabbed the familiar amber bottle. The label clearly bore my name, the correct dosage instructions, and the logo of the high-end pharmacy. I pushed down and twisted the child-proof cap, my hands shaking so violently that the plastic bottle rattled against the marble. I poured a single capsule into the sweaty palm of my left hand. The pills were distinct, housed in a clear gelatin casing that usually revealed small, coarse, dark-colored granules inside. I raised my hand to my mouth, desperate for the medication to dissolve and stop the terrifying palpitations tearing through my chest. But as my shaking fingers gripped the small capsule to place it on my tongue, I squeezed it just a fraction too hard. The delicate gelatin casing cracked open under the sudden pressure. I froze. The pill did not contain the coarse, bitter granules I was accustomed to seeing. Instead, a fine, chalky white powder spilled out from the broken casing, dusting the deep lines of my palm. I stared at the strange substance, my ragged breathing suddenly catching in my throat. The pain in my chest momentarily retreated, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. This was wrong. This was entirely wrong. I wet the tip of my index finger, pressed it gently into the mysterious white powder resting in my hand, and hesitantly touched it to my tongue. There was no bitter, medicinal chemical taste. There was only a very mild, distinctively salty flavor. A flavor I recognized instantly from 1,000 mundane moments in my life. It was baking soda. My heart hammered with a new, terrifying clarity. The expensive, imported medication keeping me alive had been systematically removed. I stood in the harsh bathroom light, staring at the white powder on my skin, grasping the horrifying reality. My own daughter had been intentionally replacing my life-saving heart medication. She was not trying to help me manage my health. She was actively accelerating my demise. Every time she smiled and handed me a fresh bottle, she was handing me a death sentence wrapped in plastic. She wanted me to have a fatal heart attack, so she could enact that forged legal document without any interference. The sheer malice of her actions was completely paralyzing. I slowly washed the useless white powder down the stainless steel sink drain, standing in silence, while watching the cold water carry away the absolute final piece of evidence of my daughter's monstrous, unforgivable, and incredibly calculated betrayal. The cold water rushed down the drain, carrying away the powdery white residue of my daughter's lethal deception. As I stood over the stainless steel basin, watching the water swirl, a profound transformation occurred within my mind. I was no longer a grieving widower, desperate for family warmth, nor a disappointed father trying to understand his children. I was Harrison Caldwell, the man who had clawed his way up from the gritty streets of Chicago to build a commercial real estate empire. I had crushed ruthless competitors and survived devastating market crashes. I had forgotten for a brief and foolish moment exactly who I was. My children had clearly forgotten as well. It was time to issue a very sharp reminder that I was the one who built the castle they were trying to steal. I dried my hands on a towel and walked back into my bedroom. I retrieved the amber plastic bottle containing the remaining fake capsules and slipped it carefully into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. There would be no furious phone calls tonight, no dramatic confrontations or emotional demands for an explanation. Confrontation without absolute leverage is a fool's errand. I needed undeniable concrete proof of their attempted murder, and I needed to uncover the full extent of the financial rot driving their desperate actions. I walked to my private elevator. My irregular heartbeat had miraculously subsided, replaced by a cold, unstoppable focus. I drove my Porsche through the quiet, pre-dawn streets of downtown Chicago. My destination was not a hospital or a police station. I navigated toward a nondescript, low-rise commercial building located in the West Loop district. This facility housed a highly secure private forensic laboratory. The owner, Gregory, was an old business associate who owed me a very significant favor. Decades ago, I had quietly financed the start of his private testing firm when no bank would take his calls. Gregory prized loyalty and absolute discretion above all else. I parked in the secure underground lot and took the service elevator directly to his personal office. Gregory was already there, drinking a mug of black coffee and reviewing a stack of technical schematics. He looked up, surprised to see me unannounced, but quickly registered my hard expression. We did not exchange pleasantries. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the amber pill bottle, and placed it firmly on the center of his glass desk. "I need a comprehensive chemical analysis of these capsules," I told him, my voice perfectly level. "I need to know exactly what substance is inside them, and I need official, legally admissible documentation detailing the results. Furthermore, this request does not exist on any official intake ledger. You do the analysis yourself, and you hand the results directly to me. No electronic trails, no digital copies floating around your servers." Gregory looked at this bottle, then looked at my eyes. He nodded slowly, picking up the plastic container with a gloved hand. "You will have your comprehensive report by this evening, Harrison," he promised quietly. I thanked him, turned around, and walked back to the elevator. The first piece of the guillotine was now firmly in place. The sun was just beginning to rise over the cold waters of Lake Michigan as I pulled out of the laboratory parking garage. I checked the gold watch on my wrist. It was approaching 7 in the morning. I knew exactly where I needed to be next. I drove toward the financial district, navigating the morning traffic, until I reached the upscale commercial high-rise, where Cameron leased his so-called development office. I had personally co-signed the lease for that lavish workspace 2 years ago. I parked my vehicle across the street in a discreet loading zone. My car featured heavily tinted windows rendering me completely invisible from the outside, while offering a perfect, unobstructed view of the main entrance to Cameron's building. I settled into the leather seat, turned off the engine, and waited in the frigid silence of the cabin. I was a patient man. Real estate development had taught me that the most lucrative opportunities require waiting for the precise moment to strike. I needed to see how a man behaves when he believes he is days away from a windfall resulting from his father's impending death. The hours ticked by slowly. Pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks wrapped tightly in thick winter coats carrying steaming cups of coffee. Delivery trucks came and went. Around 9:30 I spotted Cameron. He walked briskly toward the revolving glass doors of his building. He was wearing an expensive suit projecting the image of a titan. 20 minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. Bradley stepped out, adjusting his designer tie, and hurried inside to join my son. The two conspirators were gathering. I watched the entrance intently, my mind piecing together the timeline. They had the forged power of attorney. They had cut off my real medication. They were actively planning their next move. Shortly before noon, the glass doors revolved again. Cameron and Bradley emerged onto the busy sidewalk. Their body language was incredibly tense. Cameron was gesturing wildly, his face flushed red with agitation. Bradley was looking around nervously, pulling the collar of his expensive coat tightly around his neck. They walked quickly, avoiding the main crosswalks. They turned sharply into a narrow, shadowed service alley that ran parallel to a large parking structure. I frowned in the darkness of my car. This was highly irregular behavior for men who typically dined at exclusive steakhouses for their business lunches. I stepped out of my vehicle and silently crossed the street. I moved toward the edge of the brick building, keeping my back pressed flat against the cold masonry. I slowly edged my way toward the entrance of the alleyway, staying completely out of sight in the heavy shadows. I peered around the corner. What I saw confirmed every terrible suspicion I harbored. Cameron and Bradley were not meeting with disgruntled contractors or frustrated bankers. They were cornered deep in the damp alley flanked by dumpsters and industrial exhaust vents. Standing directly in front of them were two massive, incredibly intimidating men. They wore dark jackets and possessed the unmistakable posture of professional violence. These were brutal enforcers who operated strictly outside the boundaries of any recognized law, collecting on massive underground debts. As I watched, the larger of the two men suddenly stepped forward and violently shoved Cameron. My son flew backward, his back slamming hard against the dirty brick wall. His leather briefcase dropped, spilling architectural renderings across the wet ground. Bradley tried to step back, raising his hands, but the second thug grabbed his lapels and slammed him against the wall next to Cameron. The sheer panic on my children's faces was absolute. I stood perfectly still in the shadows, my breathing shallow and silent. My son and son-in-law were not just failing in legitimate business. They were deeply indebted to a dangerous, merciless underground syndicate that would destroy everything in their path. The pieces of their puzzle were finally snapping together with crystal-clear perfection. I watched the larger of the two thugs press his thick forearm violently into Cameron's throat. The damp brick wall scraped loudly against my son's expensive tailored suit. My own breathing slowed to a deliberate, measured rhythm. I did not feel the freezing Chicago wind biting through my cashmere overcoat anymore. I felt only the cold, mechanical calculation of a man who desperately needed to secure absolute proof. I stepped out from the relative safety of the street corner and moved silently into the mouth of the service alley. The ground was slick with melting ice, but my expensive leather shoes made absolutely no sound against the pavement. I slid behind a large rusted steel dumpster located just 15 feet away from where the brutal confrontation was taking place. The foul stench of decaying garbage and damp cardboard filled my nostrils, but I ignored the smell completely. I reached into my inner pocket and slowly pulled out my smartphone. I opened the voice recorder application and pressed the red circle. The screen illuminated slightly, casting a faint glow in the shadows as the timer began ticking upward. 1 second. 2 seconds. I held the device securely against the cold metal of the dumpster, ensuring the tiny microphone at the base was pointed directly toward the 4 men. I needed their voices. I needed their exact words permanently captured in digital ink. The larger thug leaned in closer to Cameron, his voice a deep, menacing rumble that carried perfectly through the crisp winter air. He did not seem like a man who negotiated. He seemed like a man who simply executed orders with absolute and terrifying precision. "You owe my employer $4 million, the thug growled, his massive grip tightening mercilessly on my son's silk collar. "Your little real estate projects are completely underwater. Your brother-in-law here lost his entire venture fund playing stupid games with fake digital currency. My employer does not care about your market excuses. He wants his money, and he wants it securely transferred by Friday. If the funds are not wired by the close of business, we are going to start breaking the things you use to walk." Bradley let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. He threw his hands up in the air, his palms facing outward in a frantic gesture of complete submission. "Please, you have to listen to me," Bradley begged, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the desperate words. "We have the money. I swear to you on my life we have the money. We just need a tiny bit more time to access the restricted accounts." The thug turned, his massive head slowly glaring at Bradley with pure, unfiltered disgust. "You do not have time," he stated flatly, stepping away from Cameron just enough to point a thick finger at Bradley. "You are completely out of time." Bradley shook his head frantically, pointing a trembling finger toward Cameron. "No, please listen to us," he pleaded again. "We just secured a medical power of attorney over my father-in-law's entire estate, Harrison Caldwell. You know that name. Everyone in this city knows his name. He is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He has a premium commercial plaza downtown that is completely paid off. It is worth $12 million in pure, unencumbered equity. We are going to use that exact property as collateral to secure an emergency bridge loan and pay you back in full, along with a 20% penalty fee for the delay. We just need 3 weeks to finalize the paperwork." The second thug stepped forward, crossing his thick, muscular arms over his broad chest. "A power of attorney requires the principal to be legally incapacitated," he noted astutely, proving he was far more than just hired muscle. "Caldwell is still walking around the city. We read the financial papers. We are not waiting for a stubborn old man to die of natural causes. We are not stupid." Cameron managed to pry the heavy arm away from his throat, just enough to speak, coughing violently, before finally finding his voice. "He is not going to last," Cameron gasped, spitting a small amount of blood onto the wet pavement. "I swear to God, he is not going to last much longer. His heart is failing right now. He had a massive episode just 3 days ago at my sister's house. We have the private doctors on standby. The very moment he strokes out my sister, and I take total legal control of the entire holding company. The deed to the commercial plaza is already sitting right there in my desk upstairs. We have the corporate loan application fully prepared and signed. We just need him to drop." Cameron paused, wiping his bruised mouth with the back of his trembling hand. His next words hit me with the destructive force of a runaway freight train. "My dad is basically already a corpse," Cameron sneered, a twisted, desperate smile forming on his battered face. "Just give us 3 weeks. I promise you, the old man will be in a body bag by then, and you will have every single penny we owe you." I stood completely frozen behind the rusted steel dumpster. The recording timer on my phone silently crossed the 3-minute mark. The scattered puzzle pieces suddenly locked together with horrifying, undeniable precision. They were not merely waiting for nature to take its inevitable course. They were actively and maliciously orchestrating my death. The baking soda hidden inside my imported pill bottles was not just a cruel trick to save some money on expensive prescriptions. It was a direct, calculated instrument of murder. Victoria was systematically swapping the life-saving capsules to deliberately induce a massive fatal cardiac arrest. Bradley and Cameron were managing the legal fallout to steal my assets the exact moment my heart finally stopped beating. My entire family had conspired to murder me for a $12 million commercial plaza simply to pay off their reckless underground gambling debts. The sheer terrifying magnitude of their plot settled over my shoulders like a heavy lead shroud. They were actually going to kill me. They were standing mere feet away from my hiding spot, casually negotiating my execution date with violent, merciless criminals. I slowly lowered my phone and stopped the recording application, instantly saving the audio file to a highly encrypted cloud server. I finally had the ammunition I needed. I had their dark motive, their specific timeline, and their clear, uncoerced confession. I knew exactly what I had to do next to dismantle their entire existence. Suddenly, a sharp, prolonged vibration buzzed aggressively against my right thigh. My phone screen lit up brightly, casting a sudden reflection into the dark alleyway. I quickly muffled the vibrating device against the thick wool of my heavy winter coat, glancing down slowly at the incoming caller identification, flashing rapidly on the smooth glass screen. It was Gregory calling directly from the private forensic laboratory. I stared at his glowing name, knowing perfectly well that the official chemical results, verifying the absolute toxicity of my fatal daily pills, were waiting for me. I accepted the call, raising the device to my ear. I waited for Gregory to speak. The alleyway silence was broken only by the receding footsteps of my son and the enforcers. Harrison Gregory said, his voice stripped of professional detachment. I ran the analysis twice. The capsules you gave me contain 0 traces of your cardiac medication. They are filled entirely with sodium bicarbonate. It is pure baking soda. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the freezing steel of the dumpster. The confirmation felt like a physical blow. My own flesh and blood had methodically planned my execution. This was premeditated attempted murder orchestrated to accelerate an inheritance payout and cash in on my life insurance. "Thank you, Gregory," I whispered. "Secure the physical report and the remaining capsules in your primary vault. Do not release them to anyone until I arrive." I ended the call. The sorrow threatening to consume me completely evaporated, leaving behind absolute clarity. I stepped out of the filthy alleyway and walked back toward my vehicle. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and dialed the only man ruthless enough to handle the impending war. Victor answered on the second ring. He was my corporate attorney, a man whose brilliant legal mind was matched only by his complete lack of human empathy. He had warned me about my children's reckless spending for years. I had ignored his warnings out of blind paternal love. I was not going to ignore him anymore. "Victor." "I need to see you right now," I said. "Cancel your afternoon appointments. I am driving to your office." It took 20 minutes to navigate the congested traffic and reach his private building. Victor operated out of a highly secure suite on the top floor of a black glass tower. There were no receptionists, only thick steel doors and retinal scanners. I swiped my access card and stepped into the expansive room. Victor was standing by his desk. He took one look at my face and locked the doors. I sat down across from his desk and laid everything out. I played the audio recording from the alleyway, letting the voices of my son and son-in-law fill the silent room. I watched Victor's eyes narrow as Cameron bragged about my failing heart and the $12 million commercial plaza. I told him about the baking soda. Victor remained silent for a long moment, processing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. He did not offer any useless platitudes or feigned sympathy. He simply reached for his encrypted laptop and began typing with furious precision. "We are going to audit every single piece of paper connected to your entire estate," he stated coldly. "We are going to find out how far this rot has spread." For the next 4 hours, we tore through digital files, corporate ledgers, and banking records. We pulled up the holding company documents, the real estate deeds, and the trust fund parameters. Victor Cross referenced every recent inquiry made into my accounts, searching for the footprints my children had left behind. The room grew dark as the winter sun set outside the expansive windows, but neither of us stopped working. I fueled my focus with black coffee and pure anger. Finally, Victor let out a sharp breath. He turned his laptop screen toward me, tapping a manicured finger against a scanned document that had surfaced from a corporate registry search. "Look at this, Harrison," he commanded, his voice tight with alarm. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. It was a formal application for a commercial bridge loan requesting exactly $4 million. The collateral listed to secure the enormous sum was my completely paid-off $12 million downtown commercial plaza, the same property Cameron had bragged about in the alleyway. I looked at the final page. My signature was resting perfectly on the dotted line. It was a flawless forgery. If I had not known with absolute certainty that I had never authorized this transaction, I would have believed I had signed it myself. The slant of the letters, the pressure of the pen, the slight hesitation on the final curve, it was a terrifyingly accurate replication of my handwriting. Cameron and Bradley did not just draft a medical power of attorney to use after your heart stopped, Victor explained, his eyes locking onto mine. They have already submitted this fraudulent loan application to a private, highly unregulated lending firm. This firm is notorious for moving money quickly without asking too many questions, provided the collateral is solid. They are attempting to fast-track the cash distribution to pay off that syndicate before the end of the week. I stared at the forged signature, feeling a fresh wave of disgust wash over me. They were using my name to secure dirty money, betting my life's work against their underground debts. If this lending firm approves the application and pushes the $4 million through to your son, the syndicate gets paid, but you are left holding the bag, Victor warned. Because the loan is secured by your commercial plaza, the moment Cameron defaults, the lenders will seize your property. You will lose the plaza entirely. But that is not the worst part. If federal authorities discover that your company was used to funnel $4 million to a violent syndicate, they will not care about your children. They will see your signature on the loan documents. They will freeze your entire empire, seize your remaining assets, and you will personally face federal fraud and racketeering charges. You will die in a penitentiary while your children walk away with whatever is left. The reality of his words hung heavily in the quiet office. My children had constructed a trap so intricate and deadly that it threatened to obliterate everything I had ever built and throw me in a cage. I met Victor's cold, calculating gaze. The time for sorrow had long passed. I was dealing with ruthless predators, and I needed to become the apex predator in the room. "We cannot just cancel the loan application," I stated firmly. "If we simply block the transaction, the syndicate will follow through on their threats against Cameron, and my children will vanish into the wind to avoid the fallout. I do not just want to stop them, Victor. I want to destroy them completely. I want them to face the absolute maximum consequences for what they have tried to do to me." Victor leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. A dark, predatory smile slowly spread across his face. "If you want to destroy them, Harrison, then we cannot interrupt the process right now," he said softly. "We have to let them believe they are winning. We have to let them step right up to the edge of the cliff. We need to set a trap that catches them in the exact act of executing the fraud, with the authorities waiting in the shadows to snap the cuffs on their wrists." I looked across the wide expanse of the desk at Victor, watching the calculating gleam in his dark eyes. The sheer audacity of his proposition was completely breathtaking. We were not going to stop my children from executing their fraudulent scheme. We were going to actively assist them in building their own legal gallows. I nodded slowly, a profound sense of grim satisfaction settling deeply into my bones. Victor turned his attention back to his heavily encrypted laptop, his fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard as he began to outline the parameters of our counterattack. He explained that if we simply alerted the authorities right now, Cameron and Victoria might possess enough plausible deniability to slip through the cracks of the justice system. They could easily claim they were merely preparing contingency documents out of loving concern for my failing health. We needed an undeniable recorded act of severe financial fraud to guarantee their absolute destruction. To achieve this flawless victory, Victor proposed drafting a completely new medical power of attorney. This document would be a masterful piece of total legal deception. On the surface, it would look exactly like the draft Cameron had accidentally dropped on my penthouse floor. It would feature the same broad strokes, the same sweeping declarations of conservatorship, and the same absolute transfer of my vast real estate empire into their greedy hands. It would grant them the explicit authority they desperately craved to leverage my downtown commercial plaza against their massive underground debt. However, Victor was a brilliant maestro of burying lethal consequences within walls of impenetrable legal jargon. He meticulously embedded what he called a poison pill clause deep within the 7th page of the dense contract. It was completely hidden behind complex layers of standard indemnification language and routine banking compliance codes. The mechanism was elegantly ruthless. The exact moment my children presented this specific document to any financial institution and attempted to execute a transfer or secure a corporate loan exceeding $100,000, the poison pill would automatically activate. It would instantly and irrevocably freeze every single bank account tied to my primary holding company. Simultaneously, the execution of the hidden clause would generate an automated high-priority alert directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, sending them a complete digital package containing the fraudulent loan applications, the unauthorized asset transfers, and the perfectly forged signatures. My children would literally be triggering their own federal indictment the very second they tried to cash out. I read the brilliant clause on the bright screen, marveling at the cold efficiency of Victor's legal mind. It was the absolute perfect trap designed to use their own ravenous greed as the primary mechanism of their spectacular downfall. But for the trap to work flawlessly, I had to ensure they actually used this specific document, not the version they had paid their own sleazy lawyer to draft. I had to hand it to them willingly. I had to sit directly in front of the monsters who were slowly trying to murder me and convince them that their cruel plan had succeeded completely. I needed to play the role of the terrified dying father, surrendering his entire legacy to his supposedly capable heirs. It would require the absolute greatest performance of my entire life. Furthermore, Victor sternly reminded me that documentary evidence of the triggered poison pill was excellent, but securing a simultaneous audio recording of them actively celebrating the fraud as they executed it would guarantee a maximum federal prison sentence. I needed eyes and ears inside the room when they finally took the bait. I left Victor's secure office building as the late evening traffic began to clog the freezing Chicago streets. I drove directly to an exclusive boutique located in the high-end retail district. I needed a prop for my performance, something that would perfectly suit my cultivated image as an aging corporate titan while secretly serving a much darker purpose. I purchased a stunning heavy Mont Blanc pen. It was a beautiful writing instrument crafted from polished black resin and accented with gleaming platinum hardware. It cost over $1,000, a sum that guaranteed Cameron would eagerly pocket it the exact moment I carelessly left it behind on the desk. But the true value of the expensive pen was not in the platinum trim. Before leaving the boutique, I visited a discreet private security specialist operating out of a heavily guarded basement office just 3 blocks away. For an exorbitant cash fee, he quickly removed the decorative cap of the luxury pen and seamlessly installed a military-grade microtransmitter inside the hollow chamber. It was a highly sophisticated audio bug, completely undetectable to the naked eye, capable of transmitting crystal-clear, high-definition sound to a secure application on my smartphone for up to 48 hours. The heavy pen felt cold and powerful in my palm as I finally drove back to my downtown penthouse. I took the private elevator up to my empty sanctuary, the sprawling silence greeting me like an old friend. I placed the poisoned legal documents meticulously on the center of my large glass coffee table. I set the bugged Mont Blanc pen resting casually right beside the signature line, a shiny platinum lure waiting patiently for the rats to bite. I walked into the master bathroom, splashed freezing cold water on my face, and deliberately rubbed my eyes until they were bloodshot and deeply shadowed. I needed to look thoroughly exhausted. I needed to look exactly like a man whose heart was finally giving out. The physical toll of the previous few days actually made the grim illusion quite easy to manifest. I stared at my weary reflection in the vanity mirror, practicing the weak, trembling posture of utter defeat. I then walked slowly back into the living room, sat heavily in my leather armchair. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished floorboards of my penthouse. The wind howled against the reinforced glass windows, echoing the storm that was about to unleash inside these walls. I thought about the baking soda, the forged signature, and the brutal thugs in the alleyway. Every single shred of paternal affection I had ever harbored for my children had been entirely extinguished, replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve to see justice served. They believed they were hunting an old, weak man, completely unaware that they were stepping directly into the jaws of a trap designed by a master. The stage was perfectly set. The shiny platinum bait was expertly positioned for maximum effect. I took one final deep breath, steadying my frayed nerves for the upcoming performance. I picked up my phone and opened a group text message to Victoria and Cameron. I typed the exact words slowly, my thumb hovering deliberately over the bright screen. I told them to come to the penthouse immediately tonight. I wrote that I had just received some terrible medical news and desperately needed to make sure they were legally protected before it was too late. I hit send, placed the heavy phone down, and waited for the ultimate confrontation. The wait was agonizingly short. Less than 40 minutes after I sent the text message, the secure chime of my private elevator echoed through the cavernous penthouse. The heavy steel doors parted with a soft mechanical sigh, revealing Victoria, Cameron, and Bradley. They rushed into the foyer, their faces twisted into masks of exaggerated panic and deep concern. Victoria reached me first, throwing her arms around my neck in a suffocating embrace, while Cameron and Bradley hovered closely behind her, their eyes darting around the room as if searching for a doctor or a medical machine. I did not rise from my leather armchair to greet them. I remained seated, allowing my posture to sag heavily against the soft cushions. I let my head loll slightly to the side, my breathing shallow and deliberately labored. I needed them to believe that the man who had built a real estate empire was finally crumbling into dust right before their very eyes. "Dad." "What is going on?" Victoria cried out, her voice shrill and entirely unconvincing. "You terrified us with that text message. Are you okay?" I looked up at her, making sure to keep my gaze unfocused and distant. I waited a long, excruciating moment before opening my mouth, allowing a terrifying silence to stretch across the vast room. When I finally spoke, I intentionally slurred my words, dragging the syllables out with a thick, very clumsy, and incredibly heavy tongue. "The doctors," I mumbled, letting my left hand tremble visibly against the armrest. "The doctors called me this afternoon. My heart is completely failing. The episodes are getting worse. They said I only have a few months left, maybe less, if I do not avoid all stress entirely." Cameron exchanged a rapid electric glance with Bradley. It was a very microscopic movement, a tiny fraction of a second, but I caught the sheer predatory excitement flashing brightly in their eyes. They thought their wicked plan was working perfectly. They thought the baking soda was rapidly doing its lethal job. I gestured weakly toward the glass coffee table, where a large silver tray held a fresh pot of hot black coffee. "I need a drink," I whispered, my voice incredibly frail. "Could you pour me a cup, please?" Bradley quickly stepped forward, pouring the dark liquid into a delicate white ceramic cup. He handed it to me with a reassuring smile that made my stomach turn. I reached out with my left hand, exaggerating the terrible tremor I had practiced earlier. My fingers brushed against the warm porcelain, but instead of grasping the handle, I intentionally let my hand spasm. The cup slipped from my loose grip, crashing violently onto the hardwood floor. The delicate porcelain shattered into a dozen sharp fragments, splashing hot coffee across the expensive rug and over the shiny, polished toes of Cameron's fancy designer leather shoes. I let out a pathetic gasp, pulling my shaking hand back to my chest and closing my eyes in a display of total, ultimate humiliation. "I am so sorry," I whispered, sounding entirely defeated and broken. "I just cannot control my hands anymore. My body is giving up on me. I cannot even hold a simple cup. I am becoming completely useless." Victoria knelt beside the shattered porcelain, making soothing noises while she carefully picked up the much larger pieces. "Oh, Dad, please do not say things like that," she cooed softly. "You are just tired. You need to rest. We are here to help you handle everything. You do not need to worry about a single little thing anymore." I opened my eyes and looked at the three of them, perfectly positioned around me like hungry vultures waiting for the very final breath. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket, with my right hand pulling out the thick, legally binding document Victor and I had meticulously constructed just hours earlier. I placed the folded paper gently onto the large glass coffee table right beside the gleaming platinum Mont Blanc pen. "I realized something tonight," I said, my voice barely above a raspy whisper. "I realized that my pride has been blinding me to the truth. I cannot run the company anymore. I cannot manage the properties or the trust accounts. My mind is getting extremely foggy. My body is failing rapidly. I need to make sure my legacy is completely secure before my heart finally gives out. I need you to take over the empire for me." Cameron stared at the folded document, his breath catching audibly in the quiet room. He slowly reached out and picked up the thick paper, unfolding it with eager, trembling hands. I watched his eyes dart hungrily across the dense legal text, scanning the broad clauses and sweeping authorizations. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. He saw a medical power of attorney, granting him and his sister absolute unrestricted control over my entire vast estate. He did not possess the legal acumen to spot the dangerous poison pill. The trap was buried very deep within the 7th page. "This is a massive responsibility," Dad, Cameron said, doing a terrible job of hiding the victorious smirk creeping onto his flushed face. "But we are ready. We will step up and protect everything you have built. You can just focus entirely on resting and feeling better. We will manage the commercial plaza, the banking accounts, and all the corporate investments. You do not have to stress about a single financial decision ever again." I nodded slowly, forcing a weak, grateful smile onto my face. "I trust you," I whispered, delivering the ultimate lie with flawless conviction. "I trust all of you to do exactly what is right for this family." I leaned forward with a heavy sigh and picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen from the thick glass table. The polished black resin felt perfectly cold in my palm. The tiny military-grade microtransmitter hidden silently inside the cap was currently broadcasting a crystal-clear signal. I held the expensive writing instrument out toward Bradley. He looked surprised, taking a hesitant step forward to accept the unexpected gift. "I want you to have this, Bradley," I said, placing the heavy pen directly into his hand. It was a custom gift from an old business partner, a symbol of extreme success and enduring power. I have used it to sign every single major contract for the past 10 long years. But I will not be signing any more contracts. My time in the boardroom is completely over. I want you to take it. Sign the future with this." Bradley excitedly gripped the beautiful pen, quickly sliding the heavy instrument into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket, securing the listening device right against his chest. They gathered their coats, whispering fake, empty promises as they excitedly backed toward the private elevator. The heavy steel doors slid silently open, swallowing the three traitors whole. The exact moment the elevator doors closed, my trembling completely vanished. I stood up perfectly straight, walked briskly to my mahogany desk, opened my laptop, put on my headphones, and connected to the audio bug. The digital interface on my laptop screen illuminated with a sharp, vibrant green waveform. I adjusted the volume dial on my heavy noise-canceling headphones, intentionally shutting out the aggressive howling of the freezing Chicago wind rattling against the thick glass of the penthouse windows. For a few agonizing silent seconds, there was absolutely nothing but the muffled rhythmic friction of fabric brushing harshly against the tiny platinum microphone. Bradley was walking briskly to the underground parking garage. Then the heavy, distinct thud of a luxury vehicle door slamming shut echoed loudly through my ears. The acoustic environment instantly compressed. They were inside Cameron's large, customized SUV. I heard the powerful engine roar to life, followed by a second heavy door closing, and then a third. A woman's voice immediately pierced the confined, intimate space of the luxury vehicle. It was Monica Cameron's ambitious wife. She must have been waiting patiently in the dark underground parking garage, the entire time lurking silently in the shadows, while her husband and sister-in-law executed their elaborate theatrical performance upstairs in my home. "Well," Monica asked eagerly, her voice tight with greedy, uncontrolled anticipation. "Tell me the act worked perfectly. Tell me we are finally done dealing with this miserable situation." A loud, sharp pop suddenly shattered the nervous tension in the audio feed, followed quickly by the unmistakable, joyous, fizzing sound of expensive champagne spilling rapidly over the glass rim of a bottle. "It worked incredibly well," Cameron announced proudly, his deep voice practically vibrating with absolute, unfiltered euphoria. "The arrogant old fool bought every single second of our miserable routine. He practically handed us the golden keys to the entire corporate kingdom without a single fight. He genuinely thinks he is gracefully stepping down out of noble family duty. He even gave Bradley this ridiculously heavy platinum pen as a parting sentimental gift. It is truly pathetic how easily he surrendered his life to us." A loud chorus of genuine, unrestrained laughter quickly filled the enclosed cabin of the moving SUV. It was a joyful, highly celebratory sound that made my stomach churn with a profound, sickening revulsion. There was no lingering sadness in their voices. There was absolutely no trace of lingering guilt over the loving father they had just emotionally manipulated and chemically poisoned. There was only the ravenous, excited glee of heartless scavengers eagerly feasting on a fresh, highly profitable kill. "Did you see him violently shaking while trying to hold that simple coffee cup?" Victoria chimed in, her loud laughter ringing sharp and incredibly cruel through the speakers. He could barely even keep his left hand steady. It was almost too difficult to watch without openly smiling. The baking soda substitution finally did its job. "I repeatedly told you both we just needed to give it a little more time to accurately simulate the natural cardiac deterioration. He is entirely convinced his weak heart is completely failing on its own. He has absolutely no idea he has been swallowing cheap cooking supplies for the last 3 entire weeks. You are an absolute genius, Victoria." Monica praised loudly, the sharp clinking of crystal glass, clearly indicating they were actively toasting their wicked success. I was honestly starting to get severely worried the fake white pills were not going to trigger a severe enough medical episode before the underground syndicate completely lost their patience with us. But that dramatic performance tonight was flawlessly timed. Now we just have to carefully figure out exactly what we are going to wear to the formal reading of the will. I am already actively picking out elegant designer outfits for his upcoming funeral. Solid black is always incredibly slimming, but I think a dark navy veil might look a bit more appropriately tragic for the heartbroken, grieving daughter-in-law. "Focus your minds, everyone," Cameron interrupted sharply, his tone shifting instantly from jubilant celebration to strictly ruthless business. The expensive funeral outfits can easily wait until the miserable old man actually flatlines in his bed. Right now, we have a very tight financial schedule to manage perfectly. The violent syndicate gave us an absolute non-negotiable deadline, and I am certainly not taking any more foolish chances with those dangerous animals. So what is the exact financial timeline? Bradley asked anxiously, his voice still carrying a faint, undeniable trace of residual panic from their terrifying, physical encounter in the damp alleyway earlier that very afternoon. Do we actually have to wait for him to officially die before we can freely access the commercial plaza funds? Because if that massive thug shows up again, I am getting on a private plane and leaving the country permanently. Forget the funeral entirely, Cameron stated firmly, the low, steady sound of the luxury vehicle accelerating onto the dark interstate highway, humming consistently in the background. We do not need to wait for him to die anymore. That was the original slow plan. The brand new power of attorney document he just willingly signed hands us immediate unconditional conservatorship right now because he formally admitted to us he is medically unfit. I am heading directly to the central bank at exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The private lending firm has the $12 million commercial loan fully approved and eagerly waiting for my authorized signature. I will personally execute the massive final transfer using this perfectly forged document. The syndicate gets their $4 million wired by noon, they get off our backs permanently, and we get to keep the remaining $8 million entirely for ourselves. By the time the old man finally strokes out from his fake medication, we will have already liquidated the most valuable asset in his entire portfolio and washed the untraceable cash through secure offshore accounts. To the old man, Victoria offered happily, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. May his remaining days be painfully short and extremely profitable for all of us. To the old man, the other three conspirators chorused back in joyful, synchronized unison. I sat perfectly still in the dark, quiet stillness of my spacious penthouse, listening intently to the muffled sounds of their continuing celebration as they drove happily through the freezing Chicago night. Every single crucial word had been flawlessly captured. Every horrific admission, every premeditated detail of their murderous plot, and every arrogant, boastful claim had been permanently recorded in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. I did not feel a single trace of remaining sorrow. I felt the absolute icy calm of a man who had just successfully secured his own salvation by meticulously documenting the undeniable damnation of his vicious enemies. I reached out with a steady finger and firmly hit the save button on the recording application. The advanced software instantly compiled the digital file, heavily encrypting the devastating audio package. I quickly opened my private secured messaging channel directly to Victor. I attached the audio file, waiting a brief moment to ensure the vital transfer was completely finished and fully secured on his end. I then typed a single final instruction to my ruthless attorney. Spring the trap. The trap was now fully armed and prepared to completely annihilate them. The crisp morning sunlight sliced through the thick floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of the central bank headquarters. It was exactly 8:55 in the morning. I sat perfectly rigid in a high-backed leather chair, my hands resting flat against the polished mahogany table. Beside me, Victor was intensely focused on a glowing encrypted laptop, his fingers poised over the keyboard like a concert pianist waiting for the conductor's cue. Directly in front of us, a massive high-definition monitor dominated the far wall, displaying a live, highly secure feed of the primary teller counters down in the main lobby. The financial institution had opened its doors less than an hour ago, but the trap we had meticulously constructed was already fully armed and waiting. I watched the silent video feed with a cold, hollow detachment. The bustling activity of ordinary citizens conducting their morning business seemed entirely foreign to me now. My entire universe had shrunk down to the specific designated counter where high-net-worth transactions were processed. Victor leaned closer to his screen, his dark eyes tracking a series of complex data streams cascading down his monitor. He had spent the entire night coordinating directly with the senior banking executives and the federal authorities, ensuring that the hidden poison pill inside my medical power of attorney would execute with absolutely devastating precision. Right on schedule, the heavy brass doors of the main entrance swung open. Cameron and Bradley confidently strode into the grand marble lobby. Even through the silent security feed, their overwhelming arrogance was completely palpable. Cameron adjusted the lapels of his expensive tailored suit, walking with the exaggerated swagger of a man who firmly believed he had just successfully conquered the world. Bradley followed closely beside him, carrying a sleek leather briefcase that undoubtedly held the forged loan application and the lethal booby-trapped legal document I had handed them just hours earlier. They approached the private teller counter, flashing charming, perfectly practiced smiles at the senior bank manager who stepped forward to assist them. I felt my jaw clench tightly as I watched my son casually place his leather elbows on the marble counter. He was so utterly convinced of his own brilliant superiority. He genuinely believed that my heart was slowly failing due to natural causes, completely oblivious to the fact that I knew exactly what Victoria had been feeding me. He thought he was merely hours away from liquidating my life's work to save his own miserable skin from the violent underground syndicate. I watched as he confidently opened his designer briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of official-looking papers. "Here it comes," Victor murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He tapped a single key on his laptop, bringing a secondary window into the center of the large monitor. This window displayed a live direct link to the bank's internal processing terminal. "He is officially presenting the documents to the senior manager right now." On the security feed, Cameron slid the thick stack of papers across the polished marble. I watched the bank manager pick up the documents, put on her reading glasses, and begin to carefully examine the first page. She flipped to the second page, her professional demeanor betraying absolutely nothing of the coordinated trap waiting just beneath the surface. Cameron leaned against the counter, casually checking his gold watch, radiating a sickening aura of victorious impatience. He wanted the $4 million wired immediately so he could pay off his terrifying debts and celebrate his massive stolen fortune. The bank manager nodded politely to my son, turned around, and inserted the finalized medical power of attorney into the high-speed digital scanner resting on the back desk. The machine hummed softly, silently, transferring the dense legal text directly into the bank's highly secure mainframes. Victor sat forward, his eyes locked intensely on the terminal display. The automated verification software is currently reading the principal text, he narrated calmly. It is scanning the authorized signatures. It is processing the primary conservatorship clauses. It is officially recognizing the request for a $12 million commercial collateral transfer. I held my breath, watching a small green progress bar slowly fill across Victor's screen. The bank manager smiled at Cameron again, typing a sequence of commands into her keyboard to formally initiate the massive loan distribution. The progress bar instantly turned a violent, flashing crimson. A sharp, piercing electronic alarm chimed loudly from Victor's laptop speakers. The entire digital terminal on the massive wall monitor suddenly locked down, completely freezing behind a bright red warning banner. The words "Federal Security Override" flashed in bold, unyielding letters across the center of the screen. "The poison pill has just been fully activated," Victor announced, a rare, terrifying smile curving his lips. "The system has officially registered the fraudulent transaction attempt." I watched the rapid, catastrophic sequence of digital events unfold with absolute satisfaction. In a matter of mere seconds, the automated security protocol violently bypassed local banking authority and directly interfaced with the federal financial grid. The hidden legal clause I had signed enacted a total immediate lockdown on every single piece of liquid capital connected to my treacherous family. Victor began reading the cascading alerts aloud as they multiplied across his screen. "Cameron Caldwell's primary checking account is now frozen," he stated coldly. "His corporate development funds are locked. Bradley's remaining investment portfolios are completely frozen. Victoria's personal accounts, her business accounts, and her private credit lines are entirely suspended. Even Monica's offshore holding accounts are currently registering a hard federal lock. They are all completely financially paralyzed. They cannot withdraw a single penny, they cannot transfer a dime, and they cannot even purchase a cup of coffee. Down in the lobby, the senior bank manager stared at her completely frozen computer screen, feigning professional confusion. She looked up at Cameron, politely apologizing for what she expertly claimed was a temporary system-wide processing glitch. She politely asked them to wait just a few moments while she contacted the technical support department to resolve the unexpected delay. Cameron sighed in heavy annoyance, rolling his eyes at Bradley and crossing his arms impatiently, still utterly convinced he was going to walk out of that building a multi-millionaire. The heavy oak door to our private boardroom suddenly opened with a quiet click. I turned my head slowly. Two men stepped into the room, their expressions carved from solid granite. They wore dark, impeccably tailored suits and possessed the quiet, commanding authority of seasoned federal agents. The lead agent approached the mahogany table, pulling a leather wallet from his inner pocket and flashing a silver badge. It belonged to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Mr. Caldwell," the lead agent said, his voice deep and entirely businesslike. "We have successfully received the automated distress signal and the complete packet of encrypted audio evidence you provided to our division through your legal counsel. The fraudulent transfer attempt has been officially verified and halted by the automated system. Our tactical team is currently positioned just outside the main lobby doors. We have your son and your son-in-law perfectly cornered at the primary teller counter. They have absolutely no viable path of escape. We are ready to move in." The second federal agent stepped forward, resting his hands on the back of an empty leather chair. "We just need your final confirmation, sir," he added respectfully. "Give us the green light, and we will place them both under immediate arrest for massive wire fraud, felony forgery, and conspiracy to commit attempted murder. We will walk them out of this building in handcuffs right now." I looked back at the live security feed. Cameron was currently pacing back and forth in front of the marble counter, clearly agitated by the continued delay, nervously checking his phone for updates from his dangerous underground creditors. Bradley was wiping a thin sheen of nervous sweat from his pale forehead. They were completely trapped, completely broke, and entirely oblivious to the catastrophic storm about to destroy their lives. I stared at the two men who had planned my death with such casual, joyful cruelty. A simple arrest in a public bank lobby was far too quick, far too sterile, and entirely too impersonal for the magnitude of their sins. I wanted to see the exact moment their arrogant illusions shattered. I wanted to witness the absolute horror in their eyes when they finally realized the helpless, clueless old man they thought they were murdering had actually orchestrated their total annihilation. "No," I said softly, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying authority that made even Victor look up from his glowing screen. The lead federal agent frowned slightly, lowering his silver badge. "Excuse me, sir," he asked, clearly confused by my sudden refusal. "You do not want us to apprehend them immediately?" I shook my head slowly, keeping my eyes firmly locked on my son's arrogant face displayed on the high-definition monitor. "I do not want them arrested at that teller counter," I commanded. "Instruct your bank manager to apologize for the delay and tell them the $12 million loan has been successfully approved and pushed through the final processing channels. Tell them the money will be completely available in their primary accounts within the hour." Victor closed his laptop slowly, a look of profound dark understanding settling over his sharp features. "You want them to believe they actually won," Victor murmured. I stood up from the heavy leather chair, buttoning my cashmere jacket, with perfectly steady hands. "I want them to firmly believe they have successfully pulled off the ultimate betrayal," I replied, my voice hard and entirely devoid of mercy. "Let them walk out of this building thinking they are victorious. Let them call their wives and celebrate their stolen fortune. I want them to eagerly come directly to my lawyer's private office this afternoon to officially celebrate their massive success. I want all four of them sitting comfortably in the same room when the federal agents finally break down the doors. I want to look them directly in the eyes when their entire world ends." The afternoon sun cast long, sharp shadows across the plush carpeting of Victor's expansive law office. I sat quietly at the absolute head of the massive mahogany boardroom table. The heavy double doors were closed, sealing us in a tomb of absolute silence. Victor stood near the corner window, his arms crossed over his chest, his face an unreadable mask of cold, predatory anticipation. He had dismissed his entire staff for the afternoon. There were no receptionists, no paralegals, and absolutely no witnesses to the impending slaughter, save for the federal agents waiting patiently in the adjacent security suite. My posture was perfectly rigid. My hands rested steadily on the polished wood. There was absolutely no trace of the weak, trembling old man who had shattered a porcelain coffee cup just hours earlier. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, savoring the bitter, scalding heat against my tongue. My mind was completely clear, completely focused, and entirely devoid of mercy. Right on schedule, the heavy oak doors swung open. Cameron strode into the boardroom first, leading the pack with the swagger of a newly crowned king. He was wearing a brand-new tailored Italian suit that likely cost more than a luxury car, a silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. Victoria followed closely behind him, draped in an elegant dark navy designer dress that she had probably selected specifically for my impending funeral. Monica and Bradley flanked them, radiating a sickening aura of smug satisfaction and unearned wealth. They were a portrait of absolute arrogance, practically vibrating with the euphoric high of their perceived victory. They genuinely believed the $12 million loan had successfully cleared the banking system. They thought the brutal syndicate was permanently handled. They believed they were finally rich, perfectly safe, and entirely free from my overbearing shadow. Their loud celebratory laughter echoed harshly against the wood-paneled walls, but the joyful sound died instantly the exact moment they actually looked at me. Cameron stopped dead in his tracks, his polished leather shoes squeaking sharply against the hardwood floor. The arrogant, victorious smirk completely vanished from his flushed face, replaced by a sudden, creeping mask of profound confusion. He stared at me, his eyes darting frantically from my perfectly steady hands resting on the table to the sharp, unwavering clarity in my eyes. Victoria bumped into his back, letting out a startled gasp as she peered over his shoulder. The confident, condescending greeting she had undoubtedly prepared caught in her throat. I did not offer them a warm, fatherly welcome. I did not slump in my chair. I simply raised my porcelain cup with a rock-solid grip, took another smooth sip of my black coffee, and set the cup down without making a single sound. There was no tremor. There was no hesitation. There was absolutely no slurred speech. "Please come in and sit down," I commanded. My voice rang out with a deep, booming authority that completely shattered the fragile illusion of my failing health. It was the precise, commanding tone of the corporate titan who had built an empire from nothing, the exact voice they had feared for their entire adult lives. Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his collar. He instinctively took a half-step backward, bumping directly into Monica, who was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The sudden, drastic shift in my physical demeanor was entirely incomprehensible to them. They had spent weeks meticulously watching me deteriorate carefully, managing my supposed cognitive decline and eagerly awaiting my final breath. Seeing me sitting there radiating pure, lethal vitality was a total impossibility. "Dad," Cameron stammered, his voice suddenly weak and incredibly small. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be resting at the penthouse. The private doctors explicitly warned us that you could not handle any severe stress. We were just coming to meet with Victor to quickly finalize some standard holding company paperwork." I ignored his pathetic, fumbling attempt at a lie. I watched them slowly shuffle toward the long table, moving with the extreme caution of cornered prey. They did not take the seats closest to me. They huddled together near the far end of the mahogany board, their designer clothes suddenly looking entirely ridiculous and drastically out of place in a room designed for total corporate warfare. Victoria practically collapsed into her leather chair, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. She could not tear her eyes away from my face, desperately searching for any microscopic sign of the sick, dying old man she thought she had successfully manipulated. "We are not here to finalize standard paperwork, Cameron," I stated coldly, letting the absolute silence of the room amplify the destructive weight of my words. "We are here to celebrate your massive success at the bank this morning. I understand you had a very productive meeting with the senior lending manager. I hear the $12 million corporate bridge loan was processed with absolute perfection." Cameron flinched, as if I had physically struck him across the face. The remaining color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He shot a frantic, desperate glance toward Bradley, who was currently staring at the floor, his entire body trembling with pure, unfiltered panic. They suddenly realized I knew everything. They realized the power of attorney document was not a secret victory, but a perfectly orchestrated mechanism of their own destruction. "I do not know what you are talking about." Cameron lied, his voice cracking terribly. "We did not execute any loans today. We were just following your specific instructions to secure the primary estate assets." "You really should not lie to me today, Cameron," I warned softly, my voice dripping with absolute venom. "I know exactly what you did at 9 o'clock this morning. I know exactly why you needed the $4 million wired immediately. I know about the massive underground debts, the violent syndicate threats in the alleyway, and the perfectly forged signatures on the commercial lending applications. I know every single miserable detail of your pathetic, greedy existence." Victoria let out a sharp, trembling sob, pressing her manicured hands over her mouth. Monica looked like she was about to vomit directly onto the expensive carpeting. The suffocating weight of their monumental failure was finally crashing down upon their shoulders. They had walked into the room expecting a joyous celebration of their newly acquired wealth, only to find themselves locked inside a meticulously designed slaughterhouse. "But the financial fraud is not the reason you are all sitting here right now," I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "The stolen money is entirely irrelevant to me. What you did to my physical body, however, is completely unforgivable." I slowly reached deep into my pocket and pulled out the translucent orange cylinder. I placed the plastic bottle onto the polished mahogany surface. I pressed my right index finger against the side and pushed firmly. The bottle rolled smoothly down the long wooden table. It came to a sudden, absolute, and utterly terrifying stop directly in front of Victoria. The translucent orange cylinder rattled slightly as it spun the tiny white capsules inside, clattering against the plastic until it bumped softly against Victoria's folded hands. She looked down at the familiar prescription bottle, her eyes widening in a sudden, horrific realization. The air in the boardroom grew incredibly thick, suffocating them with the undeniable weight of their own treachery. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers twitch instinctively, pulling away from the bottle as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. "Attempted murder," I said, my voice completely stripped of any residual warmth, echoing off the mahogany walls with the cold, hard finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. Victoria's face instantly drained of all color. Her perfectly styled features contorted into a mask of pure, desperate panic. She looked at Cameron, then back at me, her chest heaving as she desperately searched for a plausible lie to explain away the physical evidence resting directly in front of her. "Oh, Dad," she gasped, her voice trembling with a sickly, fabricated innocence. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. Attempted murder, that is completely insane. You are confused. The doctors said your mind would start playing terrible tricks on you as the heart failure progressed. You need to calm down right now before you trigger another dangerous episode." She pushed her chair back, standing up slowly, with her hand raised in a placating gesture, slipping flawlessly into the role of the deeply concerned, victimized daughter. She allowed a single glittering tear to escape her eye, rolling perfectly down her pale cheek. "I only ever wanted to help you manage your medications," she pleaded, her voice breaking with manufactured sorrow. "I organized your pill boxes because you were forgetting to take them. If there is something wrong with the capsules, it must have been a terrible mistake at the pharmacy." You cannot honestly believe I would ever do anything to hurt you. I am your daughter. I love you so very much." I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or waste my breath debating the utterly pathetic lies falling from her lips. I simply maintained my icy stare, letting her hollow performance echo through the silent room. I reached out with a perfectly steady hand, opened the lid of my encrypted laptop, and slowly pressed the spacebar. The crystal-clear audio from the microtransmitter instantly flooded the expansive boardroom broadcast through Victor's high-definition surround sound speakers. The sharp, unmistakable pop of a champagne cork echoed violently off the solid wood-paneled walls, followed by the joyful, effervescent fizzing of the expensive alcohol pouring into crystal glasses. Victoria froze. Her fake glittering tear stopped halfway down her cheek. The sickeningly sweet expression of daughterly concern completely melted away, replaced by an expression of absolute, unadulterated terror. The audio continued to play with devastating clarity. Cameron's deep, arrogant voice filled the room, bragging about how easily the old fool had surrendered the corporate kingdom. Then Victoria's own voice echoed through the speakers, loud, cruel, and completely devoid of empathy. She was laughing. She was laughing hysterically about my trembling hands and boasting about the baking soda substitution. She proudly explained how she had been systematically poisoning my pill bottles for 3 entire weeks, eagerly anticipating my fatal cardiac arrest. The sound of their own monstrous cruelty washed over them like a tidal wave of pure acid. Bradley covered his face with his trembling hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled whimper. Monica shrank back into her leather chair, her eyes darting frantically toward the heavy double doors, suddenly realizing that her offshore accounts were not the only things currently locked down. The recording captured Cameron shifting the conversation to the commercial bridge loan, eagerly discussing the forged signature and the massive $12 million payout. It played their synchronized, joyful toast to my painfully short and extremely profitable demise. I let the recording play until the final sickening clink of their champagne glasses faded into the quiet hum of the moving vehicle completely. I pressed the spacebar again, returning the boardroom to a suffocating, absolute silence. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. The damning reality of the audio file had completely eviscerated their pathetic attempts at denial. They had been caught celebrating my premeditated murder with crystal-clear, undeniable precision. Victoria slowly lowered herself back into her chair, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. She looked at the orange pill bottle on the table, then up at me, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that her entire life was completely over. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, to offer me some useless apology, but no words came out. The sheer magnitude of her monstrous betrayal had finally robbed her of her voice. Total panic suddenly erupted across the far end of the mahogany table. Cameron shot up from his chair with explosive, violent energy. The heavy wooden chair tipped backward, crashing loudly against the floor. He did not look at me. He did not attempt to apologize or explain his horrific actions. His fight-or-flight instinct had completely taken over, and he chose to run. He scrambled past Victoria, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished floorboards as he lunged desperately toward the back of the room. He reached the heavy double doors, wrapping his sweating hands around the thick brass handles. He pulled with all his strength, expecting the heavy oak to swing open and grant him an immediate escape into the hallway. The doors did not move a single inch. Cameron let out a panicked, breathless grunt, planting his feet firmly against the floor and pulling the brass handles again, twisting them violently in a frantic attempt to break the locking mechanism. The heavy metal simply rattled against the solid oak frame. "The doors are locked from the outside, Cameron," I stated calmly, my voice cutting through his pathetic struggle. "You are not leaving this room. You are going to sit down and face the absolute consequences of your actions." Cameron slowly turned around, his back pressed flat against the locked wooden doors. His chest heaved rapidly as he stared at me, completely trapped, completely broke, and utterly terrified. He looked like a cornered rat, realizing there was absolutely no way out of the dark maze. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored cashmere jacket. I pulled out a thick, perfectly organized stack of legal documents and placed them firmly on the polished wood. With a single deliberate push, I slid the stack of heavy eviction notices completely across the long mahogany table. The crisp white papers glided smoothly over the polished surface, coming to a halt right next to the bottle of fake pills. The bold black letters at the top of the pages clearly declared the immediate termination of their residencies. They were losing the luxury homes I had purchased, the exclusive penthouses I had funded, and the extravagant lifestyles I had completely subsidized. The federal agents waiting patiently outside would soon take away their physical freedom, but I was personally going to take back absolutely everything else. Victoria stared at the crisp white legal papers resting on the polished mahogany. Her trembling fingers reached out, brushing against the bold black lettering. She picked up the top sheet, reading the stark text as if it were written in a foreign language. A strangled gasp escaped her dry throat. She looked up at me, her arrogant composure dissolving into pure shock. "You are kicking us out," she whispered, her voice cracking under the devastating realization. "You cannot do this to us. This is my home. You bought that sprawling estate for us when we got married. It was a wedding gift." I allowed a cold, humorless smile to touch my lips. "I bought the estate, Victoria," I corrected her, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of paternal warmth. "I paid the exorbitant purchase price in full. I covered the massive property taxes every year. I funded the ridiculous renovations and the imported marble swimming pools. However, I never transferred the legal deed into your name. If you had bothered to read the closing documents you eagerly signed 5 years ago, you would have seen that the property is entirely owned by my corporate holding company. You and Bradley are merely listed as temporary tenants. Your lease is officially terminated. You have exactly 30 days to pack your designer clothes and vacate the premises before my private security contractors physically remove your belongings and change every single lock on the doors." Monica let out a sharp cry, frantically grabbing the second document from the stack. She rapidly scanned the pages, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into the thick paper. "Cameron," she shrieked, turning toward her husband, who was standing paralyzed against the locked boardroom doors. "He is evicting us too. He is taking back the penthouse." Cameron pushed himself away from the heavy oak doors, his face twisting into a mask of desperate fury. "You cannot just strip us of everything," he yelled, his voice echoing loudly across the room. "We have nowhere else to go. My real estate developments are currently tied up in litigation. We do not have the liquid cash to buy a new house on 30 days' notice. You are destroying our lives. You destroyed your own lives the exact moment you decided to treat my business empire like your personal piggy bank," I countered, my voice rising with undeniable authority. "Do not lie to me about your real estate developments being tied up in litigation. Your developments are completely underwater. You grossly mismanaged the construction budgets, alienated your primary investors, and defaulted on 3 separate commercial loans. You are bankrupt, Cameron. You have been quietly bleeding cash for 2 entire years, desperately trying to maintain the pathetic illusion of a successful corporate tycoon. And you, Bradley." I continued, shifting my icy gaze toward my terrified son-in-law. "You lost your entire venture fund, playing stupid games with unregulated digital currency. You gambled away millions trying to outsmart the financial markets, and you lost absolutely everything." Bradley shrank back into his leather chair, his face turning an ashen shade of gray. The undeniable truth hung heavily in the suffocating air of the boardroom. I leaned forward, resting my forearms firmly on the mahogany table. "I know exactly why you are both so desperate for cash," I stated, dropping the final devastating piece of the puzzle directly onto the board. "I know all about the $4 million you currently owe to the violent underground syndicate. I know about the massive enforcer who pressed his forearm into Cameron's throat in that filthy service alleyway yesterday afternoon. You needed cash immediately to save your miserable lives, and you decided that murdering me and stealing my commercial plaza was the easiest way out." Cameron swallowed hard, wiping a thick layer of nervous sweat from his brow. "We do not need your houses anymore," he spat. attempting to muster a pathetic facade of arrogant defiance. "We do not care about your petty eviction notices or your corporate holding companies. You are too late, old man. We already won. We presented the medical power of attorney at the central bank exactly at 9 o'clock this morning." The senior lending manager officially processed the paperwork. The $12 million commercial bridge loan was completely approved. The syndicate is getting their $4 million wired right now, and we are keeping the remaining $8 million. We are walking out of this room incredibly rich, perfectly safe, and entirely free from your control. I stared at my son, marveling at the sheer, boundless depth of his ignorance. I slowly picked up my porcelain cup, took another smooth sip of my hot black coffee, and set it down with a quiet, deliberate click. "You truly are a clueless fool, Cameron," I said softly. "Did you honestly believe I would just hand you the golden keys to my entire empire without a single safeguard in place? Did you actually think that thick legal document was just a standard transfer of corporate power?" I watched his defiant expression falter, replaced by a sudden creeping sense of profound dread. That medical power of attorney was specifically drafted by Victor to serve as a lethal trap, I explained, my voice echoing with ruthless precision. It contained a hidden poison pill clause perfectly buried deep within the legal jargon. The exact moment the bank manager scanned that specific document into the high-speed digital terminal, the poison pill automatically activated. I continued relishing the absolute horror blooming across their pale faces. The $12 million corporate loan did not clear the banking system. The massive wire transfer to the violent underground syndicate did not go through. The money never hit your private accounts. Instead, the automated security protocol instantly registered a highly fraudulent transaction attempt. It placed a hard federal lockdown on every single piece of liquid capital connected to this family. Your primary checking accounts, your corporate development funds, your private credit lines, and your secret offshore holding accounts are completely frozen. You cannot withdraw a single penny. You are completely penniless. You are deeply in massive debt to merciless criminals, and you are about to be entirely homeless. Victoria began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as tears streamed rapidly down her ruined makeup. Cameron staggered backward, his legs giving out as he collapsed heavily into an empty leather chair. The magnitude of their absolute failure was finally crushing them completely. "But the frozen accounts are not even the worst part of your current situation," I added, delivering the ultimate killing blow. The activated poison pill also generated an automated high-priority alert directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It sent them a complete digital package containing your fraudulent loan applications and your perfectly forged signatures. In fact, 2 federal agents are currently standing right outside those locked double doors, waiting patiently for my signal to walk in here and arrest all 4 of you for felony wire fraud and conspiracy to commit attempted murder. The devastating reality of their inescapable doom suddenly slammed into the silent room. They had entirely lost the sprawling mansions, the stolen millions, and their very freedom. They were completely cornered, stripped of all their arrogant power, and totally exposed as the treacherous monsters they truly were. Bradley stared at me, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. The sheer panic completely shattered his fragile mind. A guttural, terrifying, animalistic scream ripped violently from his dry throat. He finally snapped. Pushing off the leather chair, Bradley lunged across the long mahogany table. He knocked the scattered eviction notices into the air, reaching desperately with both hands, for my exposed throat screaming loudly that I had completely ruined their pathetic lives, just as the heavy double doors clicked unlocked. Before his outstretched fingers could even graze the fabric of my collar, the heavy mahogany double doors burst violently inward. They did not simply open. They were kicked open with a thunderous, explosive force that physically shook the very walls of the boardroom. The 2 federal agents I had spoken with earlier stormed into the room, their service weapons drawn and raised in perfect unison. A third man, wearing a sharp gray suit and a bright silver badge hanging from his neck, followed closely behind them. He was a senior investigator for the State Insurance Fraud Division. "Federal agents, stay exactly where you are," the lead agent roared, his commanding voice completely drowning out Bradley's unhinged screaming. Bradley was entirely blinded by his pathetic rage. He did not stop his clumsy, desperate attack. He continued his forward momentum, launching his body across the polished table toward me, blindly swiping at the empty air. The second federal agent moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. He holstered his weapon in a fraction of a second, grabbed Bradley roughly by the back of his expensive designer jacket, and hauled him forcefully backward through the air. Bradley hit the floor with a heavy, sickening thud, before he could even attempt to scramble away. The agent planted a firm knee directly into the center of his back, aggressively pulling his arms behind him. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Bradley's wrists echoed loudly in the confined space. Bradley instantly dissolved into a sobbing, blubbering mess, pressing his tear-stained face directly into the plush carpeting. Cameron stood completely paralyzed by the locked exit, watching the sudden, overwhelming display of tactical force dismantle his partner in a matter of mere seconds. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, his eyes locked firmly on my son. "Cameron Caldwell, you are officially under arrest for massive federal wire fraud, felony forgery, and conspiracy to commit a severe financial crime against a federally insured banking institution," the agent stated coldly, reading the devastating charges with practiced clinical detachment. "Put your hands behind your back right now, or I will put you on the floor exactly like your friend." Cameron did not resist. His entire body simply gave up. His shoulders slumped heavily in total defeat as he slowly turned around, placing his hands flat against the expensive oak paneling of the boardroom door. The agent stepped up behind him quickly, securing his wrists in cold steel. "You are facing decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary," the agent added quietly, patting down Cameron's tailored pockets to search for any concealed weapons or secondary listening devices. The third man, the state investigator, turned his attention directly toward Victoria and Monica. The two women were huddled together in the corner, clutching each other in absolute wide-eyed terror. "Victoria Caldwell and Monica Caldwell," the investigator announced, pulling a thick stack of official warrants from his dark briefcase. "You are both being formally detained for systemic insurance fraud, severe reckless endangerment, and conspiracy to commit premeditated murder. We have completely secured the physical evidence from the private forensic laboratory, including the capsules filled entirely with sodium bicarbonate. We also possess the crystal-clear audio recordings detailing your systematic plan to induce a fatal cardiac arrest in order to illegally collect upon a massive life insurance policy. You have the right to remain completely silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a federal court of law." I remained perfectly seated at the head of the long mahogany table. I slowly picked up my white porcelain cup, taking another very calm, deliberate sip of my hot black coffee. I watched the four of them standing there, completely stripped of their overwhelming arrogance, their unearned wealth, and their physical freedom. The sheer, magnificent scale of their absolute destruction was finally complete. They had walked into Victor's secure office expecting to celebrate a monumental $12 million victory. They had gleefully popped expensive champagne in their luxury vehicle, laughing cruelly about my failing heart and enthusiastically planning my funeral wardrobe. Now they were absolutely nothing but pathetic, terrified criminals waiting to be processed into the unforgiving federal justice system. "You thought you were incredibly brilliant," I said softly, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "You thought you could simply poison my daily medication, forge my legal signature, and steal my entire real estate empire to pay off your reckless underground debts. You firmly believed that a dying old man would be too weak and entirely too blind to notice the venomous snakes slithering freely inside his own home. But you forgot one absolutely crucial detail. I am the man who built this massive empire from the ground up. I survived in the most ruthless corporate environments on Earth, because I always know exactly what my enemies are planning son before they ever make their first move. And you four were the most predictable, greedy, and utterly foolish enemies I have ever encountered in my entire professional life. The lead federal agent grabbed Cameron firmly by the bicep, pulling him roughly away from the wooden doors. The second agent hauled Bradley up from the floor, forcing the sobbing man to stand on his own shaking legs. The state investigator motioned for Victoria and Monica to walk toward the exit, his hand resting casually near his holstered weapon. They were being actively corralled like common street thugs, completely humiliated in front of the father they had maliciously tried to bury. The brutal reality of their situation was inescapable. They were completely penniless. Their secret bank accounts were entirely frozen under a heavy federal lock. They were deeply in debt to a violent, merciless syndicate that would undoubtedly target them even inside a prison cell. And the crisp eviction notices resting on the table confirmed they were about to be entirely homeless. As the federal agents began to physically drag them toward the open doorway to execute the final removal, Victoria suddenly broke away from the group. The sophisticated, arrogant facade she had worn for her entire privileged adult life completely shattered into a million tiny, irreparable pieces. She threw herself onto the cold, polished hardwood floor, crawling desperately forward on her bare hands and knees until she finally reached the heavy leather chair where I was quietly sitting. She looked directly up at me, her face completely ruined by smeared makeup and frantic flowing tears. Her chest heaved with violent, ragged sobs as she desperately reached out with her two trembling hands. As the heavily armed federal agents moved quickly across the room to intercept her, Victoria fell completely to her bare knees, forcefully grabbing the bottom hem of my dark, tailored trousers. She stared directly into my eyes with pure, unadulterated terror, her voice tearing painfully through her dry throat as she let out one final, desperately agonizing scream. "Dad, please," Victoria wailed loudly, her desperate fingers digging deeply into the expensive fabric of my suit pants, as the terrible reality salt of her extremely dark prison sentence finally crashed down upon her entire world. "We are your blood. You simply cannot do this to your family." I stared down at the sobbing woman clinging desperately to my trousers. Victoria looked completely shattered, her dress pooling around her knees on the polished hardwood floor. Her manicured fingers dug into the expensive fabric of my suit, her knuckles white with the terror of her impending incarceration. She looked up at me with panicked eyes, expecting to find a shred of residual paternal warmth or a moment of hesitation to expertly exploit. She found nothing. There was zero emotion in my eyes, and certainly no pity. The boardroom echoed with the chaotic sounds of federal agents securing Cameron and Bradley. Handcuffs clicked loudly. Miranda rights were recited with cold authority, and the state investigator stood patiently by. Victoria continued to weep, her chest heaving with violent sobs as she choked on her desperate pleas. She begged me to have mercy on my flesh and blood. I listened to her frantic apologies with detached silence. The heart she had systematically tried to stop beating was now functioning with absolute, terrifying clarity. I reached down with a perfectly steady hand and firmly gripped her trembling wrists. I pried her fingers away from the fabric of my trousers. She resisted for a fraction of a second before the coldness of my touch broke her spirit. Her hands fell limply to her sides. I stood perfectly tall, towering over her kneeling form, reclaiming the authority I had built over decades of ruthless corporate warfare. "You told me to shut up on Thanksgiving," I said. My voice was a soft, icy whisper that effortlessly cut through the chaotic noise of the arrests unfolding across the room. Victoria instantly froze, her violent sobbing abruptly caught in her throat. She stared up at me, completely stunned by the sudden reference to a holiday dinner she had likely dismissed as a minor, insignificant argument. But I remembered every single agonizing detail. "You sat at my table eating the food I provided, and you looked me directly in the eyes with absolute disgust," I continued, my voice devoid of parental affection. "You told me that I was a useless old man. You told me my opinions were entirely irrelevant, that I was ruining your evening, and nobody cared for me anymore. You mocked my failing health. So I walked out of that dining room. I took my keys, I walked out the front door, and I said I would never come back. Victoria let out a pathetic, suffocating gasp. She desperately tried to shake her head, her ruined makeup smearing further across her pale cheeks. Dad. No. She pleaded weakly, her voice barely a whisper. I was just stressed. I was angry. I did not mean any of those terrible things. I swear I did not mean it. I kept my word. I stated with absolute unyielding finality, you are no longer my family. I did not wait for her to formulate another miserable excuse. I did not give her the satisfaction of another glance. I smoothly stepped entirely over her trembling body, my leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The state investigator immediately stepped forward, grabbing Victoria firmly by the upper arm and hauling her to her feet. The cold steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around her wrists sounded like the ultimate conclusion to a lifetime of ungrateful treachery. I walked deliberately toward the heavy double doors. Victor was standing quietly near the corner of the room, his laptop securely closed, his arms crossed over his chest. He gave me a single, respectful nod. The legal trap had been executed with absolute perfection. The corporate titan had entirely reclaimed his stolen throne. I returned his nod, adjusting my jacket, and walked completely out of the boardroom. The hallway outside was perfectly quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic destruction occurring inside Victor's office. I walked confidently toward the silver elevators. I could hear the muffled, frantic shouting of my son and son-in-law as the federal agents began dragging them toward the service exit. Then a sharp, piercing scream echoed down the long corridor. It was Victoria. She was screaming my name, wailing in absolute uncontrollable terror as the state investigators physically pulled her away to face her devastating federal charges. I pressed the elevator call button. The polished metal doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped inside the empty cab and turned around, pressing the button for the main lobby. Through the slowly closing elevator doors, I watched the chaotic scene unfolding at the far end of the hallway. Victoria was fighting against the investigator's grip, crying hysterically, her designer dress completely ruined. She was screaming for mercy, screaming for her father to save her from the dark, windowless cell she had meticulously dug for herself. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I looked directly at her one final time. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not show a single ounce of regret. I simply watched her absolute downfall, with the cold, detached satisfaction of a man who had successfully excised a deadly tumor from his own body. The thick silver doors smoothly glided shut, completely sealing off her agonizing screams, severing my final connection to the treacherous monsters I had foolishly raised. The descent to the ground floor was silent. When the elevator arrived, I stepped out into the grand marble atrium. The security guards nodded respectfully as I passed. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped directly out into the freezing Chicago afternoon. The biting wind whipped sharply across the concrete sidewalk. I pulled my coat slightly tighter around my shoulders, but the cold weather did not bother me anymore. A black town car was waiting patiently at the curb, the engine humming softly. I slid into the warm back seat. The driver closed the door, completely muting the chaotic sounds of the busy downtown traffic. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "To the airport, sir?" he asked politely. "Yes," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "Take me to the private terminal." As the heavy vehicle pulled away from the curb, I leaned back against the plush leather and finally allowed myself to take a deep, cleansing breath. The suffocating weight of the past 3 weeks was completely gone. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and checked the encrypted secure server. The digital numbers glowed brightly. My entire corporate empire, the massive real estate holdings, and the international commercial properties had been successfully liquidated. The staggering hundreds of millions of dollars were now converted into untraceable liquid cash, securely resting in heavily encrypted offshore accounts that absolutely no one could ever touch. I watched the towering skyscrapers of Chicago slowly fade away in the distance. I was leaving the freezing city behind forever. I was leaving the treacherous family who had actively tried to murder me to rot in their cold, concrete federal cells. I was free. The heart they had tried to systematically destroy was beating with a strong, healthy, and entirely unstoppable rhythm. I turned off my phone, resting my head back against the soft seat, looking forward to a peaceful life under the bright sun. 1 year later, the gentle, rhythmic crashing of the Gulf Coast waves provided a soothing soundtrack to my morning. I sat comfortably on the expansive teak balcony of my pristine beachfront villa in Naples, Florida. The warm, salty breeze swept off the ocean, carrying with it a profound sense of absolute peace that I had not felt in decades. The freezing gray skyline of Chicago, along with the treacherous ghosts that haunted it, felt like an entire lifetime away. My empire was entirely liquidated, transformed into an impenetrable fortress of liquid capital, safely secured in secret offshore accounts. I rested my tablet on the glass patio table, swiping smoothly through the morning financial reports, before opening a specific, heavily encrypted legal file forwarded by Victor. It contained the final sentencing report for the Caldwell family. I read the stark black and white text with a quiet, detached satisfaction. Cameron and Bradley had formally received 15-year federal sentences without the possibility of early parole. Their massive wire fraud and the undeniable audio evidence of their conspiracy left them absolutely no room to negotiate. They were currently locked inside a maximum security facility, permanently stripped of their tailored suits, their gold watches, and their monumental arrogance. Victoria and Monica had narrowly avoided federal prison by aggressively turning state's evidence against their husbands, but their legal survival came at a catastrophic cost. The civil suits from the defrauded banks and the massive penalties from the insurance commission had completely decimated whatever assets they possessed. The report indicated they were currently living in a squalid, rundown trailer park on the absolute outskirts of the city. My daughters, who had once complained bitterly about the temperature of their imported swimming pools, were now working exhausting minimum wage shifts just to pay off their mounting legal fees. They were completely cut off from the society they had worshipped, living the exact nightmare they had so callously tried to inflict upon me. A small, genuine smile touched my lips. I closed the legal file and opened a secondary document. It was a finalized trust agreement. Despite their parents' monstrous betrayal, I refused to let my grandchildren suffer indefinitely for sins they did not commit. However, I would not repeat the massive mistakes of my past. I had meticulously established an ironclad, completely anonymous trust fund for them. The stipulations were incredibly strict. They would only receive a single penny upon their 25th birthdays, provided they had successfully graduated from a reputable university and, most importantly, passed a rigorous, independent moral character audit. There would be absolutely no unearned wealth, no free rides, and no breeding ground for the toxic entitlement that had entirely consumed their parents. I picked up a small translucent orange bottle resting next to my tablet. I popped the cap and poured a single prescribed pill into my palm. It was a real heart medication carefully prescribed by a world-class cardiologist who marveled at my remarkably strong constitution. I placed the pill on my tongue and swallowed it down easily. I placed my hand flat against my chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of my heart. It beat perfectly strong and unyielding. I reached for my crystal glass, taking a slow, appreciative sip of neat 20-year-old scotch. The amber liquid burned pleasantly as it went down. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes as the bright Florida sun warmed my face. I was completely alone, but I was not lonely. I was finally surrounded by the absolute golden silence I had fought so fiercely to earn. I had navigated the darkest, most treacherous waters of familial betrayal and emerged victorious. My legacy was no longer bound by blood, but by unwavering principles and undeniable truth. I raised my glass to the empty horizon, silently toasting to my newfound freedom and the brilliant, incredibly peaceful days ahead. Today, Blood does not equate to loyalty, and unconditional love should never mean unconditional tolerance for abuse. As a parent, you spend your life building a safety net for your children, but when they twist that net into a noose to strangle you, you must have the courage to cut the ropes. Generosity without boundaries breeds entitlement, and entitlement eventually breeds monsters. True strength is not just in building an empire. It is knowing when to tear it down to protect your own dignity. Never let anyone, not even your own flesh and blood, convince you that your life is worthless. Have you ever had to permanently cut ties with deeply toxic family members to protect your own peace? Share your personal story in the comments below today. Your shared experience might give someone else the courage they need. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and return for more ultimate justice.